Well, hello there. This is Jonathan at the Piano Lesson. Nice to see you, metaphorically speaking. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and how it relates and how it's been used to write music. And people are using it now to write music. And I have some thoughts about that. And perhaps you can share your thoughts as well. So here's what prompted me to have this little talk. I enjoy listening to the radio, and I have a radio program that I enjoy listening to, talk radio program. And the host of the show, who shall remain nameless, his name is Thom Hartmann. He plays AI-generated music that his wife enjoys putting together. And the AI music, it has a political theme to it. And it's a country western style, sometimes a rap style. I'm not exactly sure why they choose to use that style of music, because they're trying to reach a liberal audience. And I'm always been under the impression that liberal audiences tend not to listen to country western music. And, you could tune into it. It's an interesting program, but you could tune into it and check out the music on it. And for any of you who've listened to AI music, let's just say it has its own sound. And there have been some calls, positive and negative, to the show about whether people like it or dislike it. And I have my own opinions about it, which I'm going to hold off on for the moment. I'm also talking about AI today because I enjoy holding this microphone. And it's just fun. I feel like Mike Douglas. I bet you don't know who Mike Douglas was. He was a talk show host back in the day. But I heard something on the program today, and as he was talking about how excited he was about being able to have this AI music, and he said that in the past, you had to be a musician in order to make music. And now, with AI, you don't have to be a musician anymore. Yes, you heard that correctly. You heard that correctly. In the past, you had to be a musician to make music, and now you don't have to be a musician to make music. So that prompted a few thoughts, and typically I try to avoid reacting to things that I hear. I try to reflect upon them. And so here's my reaction, my thoughts about that, having reflected. My first question to him would be, why do you think that you had to be a musician to make music? Evidently, there's this assumption that you have to be a musician to make music. Now, setting aside whether the music is good or bad or complex or not, but certainly, as far as I'm concerned, I've taught for decades, and I don't think I've ever met anyone that can't make music in one way or another. And so when I hear that, it makes me think that the person who's saying it might have some problems with their self-esteem. And it's not a character flaw, but you kind of wonder, well, what prompted that? So when my father was growing up, and my father was born in 1923, before the Great Depression, so very different time. They actually had inkwells in desks. They didn't even have ballpoint pens back then. But he would tell me about how the children, the students, young children, were asked to sing. And if you could sing, then you were put in one group. And if you couldn't sing, then you were put in another group. And they labeled you. They gave you a label. And it was called tone deaf. Tone deaf. Now, you don't hear that term anymore, but it essentially labeled you as someone that was incapable of carrying a pitch, carrying a tune, understanding music, etc. Now, I teach voice as well as piano, and I had great teachers, voice teachers, piano teachers, all kinds of music teachers, really great teachers. And if I must say so, I think I got pretty good on my own in both those areas. And I can tell you, just as a sidebar, that what most people consider singing is really not singing at all. Singing, usually when people sing, they use their speaking voice. And while there is an element of singing to the speaking voice, there is a separate skill that one has to learn to actually learn to vocalize. I'm going to set that aside for the moment. So simply, just because you can carry a pitch or carry a tune doesn't necessarily mean you can sing. There's a lot of skill and craft, just like anything you do. But I could tell that my father was pretty scarred by that most of his life. And on certain occasions, I had to try to convince him that just that wasn't true. And he really did love music. He had a great passion for music. My mother also had a great passion for music. Now, she, on the other hand, did actually end up studying music at an advanced level at Brandeis University with actually took some classes with Leonard Bernstein. But it made me think that here's someone that has the impression that you can't make music unless you're a musician. Now, I used to spend a lot of time around pianos and restoring old pianos, and I came to acquire a great deal of knowledge about pianos and piano manufacturing and the history of pianos. And probably around when my father was a kid, or before then, but in the early part of the 1900s, up until the Great Depression, probably had about 400 piano manufacturers in this country. And every home that could have a piano did have a piano. It was considered something that people would be desirable. And in order to hear music, you had to make music. Kind of like ice cream, right? Today we can go to the store and buy any kind of ice cream. You don't have to make ice cream at home, but it sure tastes better when you do, usually. And most of the brands of ice cream, I mention ice cream because it's the summer, but everyone's got their favorite brand, right? Most of the brands we probably wouldn't buy, unless we were desperate. So, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Yes, okay. So everyone had a piano in their home, and yes, there were sound recordings, there were audio recordings, there was radio, but that's really wasn't the main way people got their music. The main way people got their music was by hearing it live. And certainly in the New York area where I grew up, right up until maybe the 1970s and 80s, there were hundreds of rooms that you could go and hear piano music, live music in hotels. That's all gone now. It's all been replaced by recorded music. And so there was this ethic, if you will, that one needed to learn music to some extent, whatever extent that was. And there are also lots of books and methodologies, because this was also kind of right around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and there were method books and methodologies were very popular. Systematization and repetition and assembly line methods. So you would get a book, and if you followed the book, you followed the course, you would go from point A to point B. You would get good, right? That wasn't quite true either. Well, that's a whole nother subject we can discuss. And I'll come back to this in a minute probably. So now, assuming that you make the statement, you say, well, in order to make music, you had to be a musician. Now you don't have to be a musician. You can use artificial intelligence to make music. And here's my next question. How do you know that you're making music? Think about it. Just because a chatbot spits out something, how do you know it's true? And anyone who's used a chatbot, and I've used them extensively, I've used ChatGPT extensively, it's deranged. It is not reliable at all. In a whole variety of subjects. Would you take $100,000 and let the chatbot give you investment advice? Would you talk to it about your health condition and have it diagnose you? Would you ask legal advice from it? Yes, we've all done those things, but ultimately we would go to a doctor or a lawyer. We really wouldn't rely on it. And Lord knows the chatbots have spat out a lot of effluent. So, but somehow that type of critical thinking isn't used when you're dealing with music. Just because it spits out music, it's just taken at face value. Now, it might be music-y. You might think it's music. For instance, when you go to the drive-up window at McDonald's and you order a hamburger, how do you know it's a hamburger? How do you know it's food? And it sounds funny. I remember once being in the grocery store, we were shopping for whipped cream, and my friend picked up Cool Whip, and I said that's not whipped cream. And we read the ingredients, and there was no cream in the whipped cream. It looked like whipped cream. The label said whipped cream, but there was no whipped cream. And I remember a woman kind of laughing about that. I mean, if you think about it, most of the things that we are told to do and told to buy in this society, we're told to do because not because it's wholesome, right? I think it comes down to a very simple reason. Most of the decisions we make have to do with the fact that we think that the decision will give us power, some kind of power. And the same is true with music. If you like a song, if you like a piece of music, somehow that gives you a sense of power. And if two people come together and they both like the same song, well, then they feel even more powerful. And if someone comes along and says, well, I don't like that song, or I don't like your band, well, then you get angry. And why do you get angry? Well, because now you don't have the power anymore. Now your power is being questioned, right? So to have a discussion of whether or not music is good or bad, or whether a song is good or bad, or any of that, really is counterproductive. I mean, it's not going to lead anywhere. But I will say this. Musicians spend their whole lives, if they're serious about music, asking a simple question. Am I making music? Am I making music? It sounds like a ridiculous question, maybe too obvious. But you could spend, say, 4 years of your life learning a Beethoven sonata and still not really understand what you're doing, and then take it to a teacher, and they might give you a critique or a criticism, and maybe it'll make sense to you, maybe it won't. Maybe you'll understand their point of view, maybe you won't. Maybe you might be able to incorporate their suggestions fairly quickly, or it might take you another 4 years just to be able to incorporate their suggestions. I had someone, an old student of mine, asked me if composers ever made mistakes in the score, because of all the comments and criticisms I've heard about learning music and master classes, the number one, the number two, number three thing that you have to learn to do is read the score. And it takes a lifetime to learn to read a score. There was an article in the New York Times. There's a Swedish conductor, and his name escapes me at the moment, but he's 97, I think, just turned 97. And he mentioned that after 60 years of looking at a score, he just discovered a particular aspect or marking that he'd never noticed before. So Beethoven, Chopin, Bach, no, they don't make any mistakes. None. Zero. Now, I will say this. Yes, Beethoven was deaf, so he wrote orchestrations in some instances that needed to be modified and revamped because he might write out of the range, the realistic range of a singer, let's say. But the music itself was mostly, flawless. And it was the copyists and it was the publishers. It was like the telephone game that really screwed up the message. But serious musicians, serious artists spend their whole lives learning. And that's why we like to teach, because it helps us learn. And it helps us to take old problems and look at them fresh and look at them in new ways. In fact, that was one of the things that I was reading that Arthur Rubinstein, a great Arthur Rubinstein pianist, had said. But I think he was 43 at the time, and I just had some kids, and I'm not going to say the joke, it wasn't a joke about Rubinstein, but he was the first person to say that he was kind of born lazy and never really practiced and had a lot of mistakes in his playing and just practiced enough to kind of get by, and he had a great personality. And then one day he said, you know what, I really need to practice. And he locked himself in his little guest cottage on his property, mainly because he didn't want his kids to think that he was second rate. But in the process of practicing again, he became inspired because he found new things in the music that he never really had known before. That's the beauty of playing music, is that it's this world that you discover. It's a limitless world, especially a great composer's world. And it does take a certain amount of years until the process of making music becomes subconscious. I would say most of what goes on is out of our control. It's really subconscious, but it has to become second nature. Now when I play personally, I have no idea who the person is who's playing. I listen to the music, and at this point, I'm happy to say that I typically like it, but it's like I have released my ego in the sense that it's whatever is coming out is something internally, something sub rosa, and it's this. We're sort of tapping into this unseen world, this subconscious world. That's really what's going on. So the process of making music connects us to music. And here's the thing. We're all innately music. We are the very thing that we think we're making. And when we first embark on becoming musicians and making music, we think of music as the song as something that's separate, that's outside ourselves, and we're sort of looking from the outside through the window into the house, right? But at its core, the universe is vibration. And I don't want to start to sound a little bit too, they used to say new age. I don't think they use that word anymore, but or spiritual, but because it's not my intention. But I do think that we are music. Now, going back to what I was saying, how do you know you're making music? Well, musicians, again, they spend their lives asking that question, taking their work to people they respect, listening to it, from various vantage points. I mean, it's not so easy. Now, you could have some pat answers, I suppose. You could say it has a certain structure or a certain rhythm or a certain, I will tell you the one thing, and I'll give you my opinion about AI in general. Music has to breathe. I remember telling a student once that, it was important to play with a metronome. I thought it was important to practice with a metronome in the beginning, because in the beginning, even the concept of a steady beat, what a steady beat is abstract. And it takes a while to really understand what a steady beat is. So you use a metronome to help you, and Beethoven used metronomes. But I said to the student, if that's all you can do, then you're really not playing music, because music has to breathe. Every note has a life of its own. And he said to me, well, you're an elitist. And I couldn't for the life of me understand what would prompt that response. It seemed rather odd to me, but I suppose that maybe I was making them feel insecure in some way, I think what happens is that one's ego can become overly invested in what they're doing. I think that's why if you go up to someone and say, well, that song stinks, and it might stink, but they get angry. Conversely, if you're a real student of music and you're in a lesson and the teacher says that stinks, you say, yeah, it stinks. And if you're a good student, you probably know it stinks or know why it stinks or whatever, but you don't react. You don't, most teachers won't behave that way anyway. And frankly, I don't really think there's a place for that, and it's really unnecessary. But AI doesn't breathe, something that's metronomic. I mean, there are a lot of just the whole concept of keeping a steady beat. There are drummers that find the use of a metronome anathema to making music. Even the essence of jazz, right? So jazz itself, if you have to define jazz, if I had to define jazz, I would define it as the eighth note, the conception of the jazz eighth note. So an eighth note typically being when you take a beat. Usually we represent the beat by a quarter note, and if you take a beat and subdivide it in two equal parts, you end up with two eighth notes. And if you're playing classical music in general, you will play those eighth notes equally. So if you have your quarter note 1, 2, 1, and 2, and equal eighth notes, right? Jazz doesn't do that. Jazz makes them unequal, makes one longer and one shorter. How much longer and how much shorter? Well, that's a matter of opinion. It's not metronomic, I can tell you that. Now, the closest approximation, one of the closest approximations, is if you take the beat and subdivide it into 3 equal parts and play the first and third subdivision and hold the first one. So here's your beat again. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, bum, 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 long, short, long. That's an approximation. But really, that's not a jazz eighth note. And if the whole piece uses that kind of subdivision, well, then the meter will probably reflect that. It'll probably be in some kind of a compound meter, like 6/8 or 12/8 or something like that. You can subdivide the beat into 4 equal parts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 E and a 2 E and a ta, 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 ta. That's still not the jazz eighth note. And so dee da do da do dee da do. There's your jazz eighth note. no way to really notate it. And there's also some discussion as to how you accent it. Do you accent the first note louder and the second one softer, or vice versa? Soft, loud, soft, or do you go loud, soft, loud, or do them equally? That's another element. How you play the notes, the phrasing, is equally as important, if sometimes not more important than the notes themselves. AI doesn't care about that. And even if you listen to the pitch, the concept of intonation, the whole idea of having something that's in tune is really an overly rigid concept. This is why we have musical instruments that can vary their intonation in exquisite increments. So you can have a note that's slightly higher, or slightly sharper, or slightly lower, and you're always not only aware of your own pitch, right? But if you're playing with other people or an ensemble, you're matching someone else's pitch, or matching someone else's vibrato, or matching someone else's phrasing, and you have to come to some kind of a meeting of the minds where that's concerned. And if you hear the AI music, it almost sounds like the voice is a ping pong ball, kind of like whacking back and forth. I'm sure everyone out there knows what auto-tune is by now. My favorite use of auto-tune actually was years ago when Cher came out with her tune, like, you gotta believe, which I kind of liked. I liked Cher. I liked the one where she kind of was on a battleship straddling the artillery. That was fun. In some kind of negligee. It sounds like they're singing underwater. So, kind of trying to wrap this up a bit, the two questions are, A, why do you think you have to be a musician to make music? Well, you might need to be a musician to make music, at least really good music, or complicated music, or make music consistently. And if you're making music, how do you know that what you're making is in fact music? And of course, the word music, what is music? Can you define that? It's almost like defining the word God. Can you define the word God? What is God? What is music? There's a lot of music in the world. It's a big world. I would say, at the very least, music is based on vibration and the symmetry that exists in nature in the overtone series. And it also is combined with the heartbeat. And on that, I think we've talked long enough today, but if you have any comments, or you can just comment on how you like my new microphone, please let me know. This is Jonathan at the Piano Lessons, signing off. Until next time, au revoir.